Today's topic is planning in uncertain times and will be presented by Dr. Robert Swaim. Dr. Swaim combines over 40 years of practical international business experience with a distinguished record of teaching strategic management at the graduate level. He has collaborated with Peter Drucker, the father of modern management, in developing Drucker's contributions to management thinking in an EMBA and executive development program for Chinese executives and managers. Dr. Swaim has spent over 10 years in China teaching, delivering, and assisting in implementation of these programs. He has been a student, colleague, and personal friend of Peter Drucker for nearly 30 years and is the author of The Strategic Drucker, which is based on this relationship. It is an honor to have him with us today. We appreciate if you would hold all of your questions till the end. There will be a slide depicting an email address that you may address questions to Dr. Swaim. So without further ado, Dr. Swaim.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Planning uncertain times. Well, obviously there is a great deal of uncertainty throughout the world, everywhere we look. The Mideast, Europe's economy, our own economy, increasing gas prices, Obamacare in the Supreme Court, the pending presidential race, and so forth. How do organizations plan in times of uncertainty? We'll try to explore this through the eyes of my former friend and colleague, Peter Drucker. Okay, let's look at some of the topics that we will try to deal with this afternoon. Planning in certain times, and we'll get into that in detail as we go through our discussion. Have an opportunity to, if Peter Drucker were alive today, to get his views on the current financial crisis, economic theory, and economists. Also downsizing. We've heard quite a bit of that during the last several years as organizations try to become more effective. And that's the traditional approach, but as Peter would say, the wrong approach. We'll also talk about the difference in what he calls rethinking and strategic thinking. We'll look at strategic thinking and planning, the whole process as described by Drucker. A concept of planned abandonment, which is a theme through many of his writings, and we'll discuss what planned abandonment really is, why forecasting does not work, and basing our planning on what Drucker would say is what has already happened that we can use to create the future and global competitors. This is a quote from Peter. The organizations most likely to suffer the most are those with the delusion that tomorrow will be like yesterday. In our workshops, executive development programs, we would have a little discussion here in terms of what did Drucker mean by this? Well, we can take one example. Just recently, old company called Kodak, and obviously tomorrow is a lot different for them, or would have been a lot different for them than yesterday. Here is a picture of Peter. He's known as the father of modern management. But many years ago, when I was studying with him at the Claremont Graduate School, we had just finished dinner at the faculty club, and we're walking back to the class for another Drucker class. And I asked him, I said, Peter, I said, do you consider yourself to be a professor of management? And he said, no, Bob, I am a social scientist. Well, in his later years, he wrote a series of books, Managing a Time of Great Change, Managing in Turbulent Times, Managing Challenges for the 21st Century, Managing in the Next Society. All these dealt with society and change, and we'll talk a little bit about this as we go through our discussion this afternoon. All told, he wrote 39 books over a 65-year career. First one published in 1939, the last one just before he passed away in 2005. He wrote thousands of articles. He was an editorial columnist for the Wall Street Journal. I can remember going to his home late one morning to pick him up to take him out to lunch, and he answered the doorbell. And I said, Peter, I said, you look very tired this morning. He says, oh, yes, Bob. He says, I was up all last night writing a series for the Wall Street Journal. And sure enough, several weeks later, the series appeared. The interesting thing, and I had the little picture of the typewriter there in the right-hand corner, he wrote all these books and articles on a manual typewriter. He did not have a PC. He did not have a secretary. He did not have an office. He worked out of his home. And also, he was a consultant to many of the Fortune 500 companies. With respect to my own background, as was just introduced, I spent the last 10 years in China developing executive programs and MBA programs based upon Peter's work for Chinese companies as well as for multinationals. And also did strategic alliance consulting, in other words, trying to put together U.S. companies wanting to enter China or to deal with Chinese companies. I also have my own firm involved in mergers and acquisitions, employee stock ownership plans, and financing, recapitalizations, and so forth. I was also a vice president with the Geneva Companies, who at one time was the largest M&A company serving the middle market. Actually, we did more deals than any company on Wall Street. And also director of OD and manpower planning for Occidental Petroleum's international operations. And then also had a stint in sales and marketing with both Xerox and Mobil Oil. I bring this up to point out that I'm just not an academic, and what I'm going to be talking about in terms of these concepts can really be applied. This is not coming from the theory, from the ivory tower. I had real jobs. One might contrast that to the current administration, where less than 8% of anybody in the administration has ever had a real job, managing a business, hiring people, and so forth. This is a picture of Peter and I going back to developing the programs for China. Picture of him in his family room, and this is where all meetings took place. As I mentioned, Peter never had an office. If you wanted to meet with him, to have him consult on your issue, you came to his house. And so this is where all business was conducted. I'm going to talk about a lot of things that are contained in my book, and I'll try, if time permits, to address this a little bit later. The book talks about the dimensions of growth, and if we look at growth from the standpoint of organic growth and external growth, these are some of the major elements that comprise growth for an organization. The issues highlighted in red, marketing, innovation, according to Drucker, are the only two functions in an organization that produce results. According to Peter, the rest are merely costs. Now, that upsets a lot of people I know in HR and finance and IT and so forth, but Peter said marketing, innovation, this is what produces results. This is a concept that I came up with and included in my teachings in China called the Drucker Gap. When we presented a concept, a Drucker concept, he often followed this up with, these are the key questions that you should ask yourself in terms of what to do. Well, there was a gap between what to do and how to apply it. He very seldom provided the necessary tools in order to apply a particular concept. And that became very frustrating to our Chinese executives. They wanted tools to be able to apply this particular concept, not just talk about it. So in order to close this gap, we added what I called other contributors to a particular discipline or pundits, if you will, such as Warren Bennis in the area of leadership, J. Roger Best in marketing, Clayton Christensen in innovation, and so forth. So these are people that we use to reinforce a particular Drucker concept or to be able to provide the necessary tools to implement a particular concept. Okay, let's take a look at what Drucker would say about the financial crisis and what criticism he might have with respect to stimulus plans. Obviously, we can go back not too distant future and look at the stimulus plan that was implemented in 2009, $787 billion stimulus plan. If we look at the other bailouts in banks, mortgages, the auto industry, and so forth, over $1 trillion. many of the elements of this plan were earmarks, or what we would call political payoffs, that really did not stimulate the economy or create jobs. So, members of Congress who had to approve this plan, as you can see it on the right, this is the actual size of the plan, 1,400 pages, were given the opportunity to read it in one night and then to vote on it. Having some spare time in China in between my teachings, I actually went through and read this whole plan. And as an example of a stimulus, one of the elements of the plan was to provide $189 million to Filipino guerrillas who helped fight the Japanese during the Second World War. Roosevelt apparently had made a promise that we would pay these people if they assisted us in fighting the Japanese, and for whatever reason they never were paid, and so in the stimulus plan included $189 million to be paid in the Philippines for these people. When one questions how does that really stimulate our economy, I leave that up for you to answer yourselves. So, what does Drucker have to say about stimulus plans? There's no correlation at all between domestic economic performance and policies to stimulate the economy. And he goes on to add that there's not one single case of government stimulating the economy, let alone of government spending turn around a recession or a depression. These are the words from Drucker when it comes to stimulus plans. Recently, the Wall Street Journal commented on Japan lowering their corporate tax rate, making us the United States the highest corporate tax rate in the world. And they went on to say in the last 4 years, we have seen numerous U.S. economic milestones. 4 years of $1 trillion deficit, some $5 trillion in new debt, the loss of America's AAA credit rating, 3 years of near zero interest rates, post-war records for federal spending as a share of the economy, and now the world's #1 corporate tax rate. So Drucker probably would not be too keen on what's happening here. And he would summarize it by saying, our economists never know anything until 20 years later. There are no slower learners than economists, and we have no economic theory today. So moving right along. As we entered into the financial crisis, a lot of organizations said we have to downsize. And we hear, in fact, you even hear politicians saying, what we have to do is look at all our expenditures and cut 10%, downsize. And Drucker goes on to say that if not most cases, downsizing has turned out to be something that surgeons for centuries have warned against, amputation before diagnosis. And as he points out, the result is always a casualty. What do we do instead? He says the alternative is rethinking themselves, strategic thinking. Where to start? By definition, strategic thinking is not strategic planning. Strategic thinking is the type of thinking that determines where the organization is today, our mission, and where is it going in the future, the vision for the future. Typically performed by senior executives as a framework for business planning, and Drucker would suggest that senior executives, not a planning department, perform this function. Strategic planning, on the other side, is business and operational or even long-range planning, how the organization will get there in terms of the strategy and the objectives. Another short story, I was bringing Peter home from lunch one day at Claremont in California. And we pulled up to his very modest home near the university, and I asked him, Peter, how long have you lived here? And he said, 31 years. I came out from NYU, where he was teaching, one summer to do a workshop series at Claremont, and I never went back. That's why I don't teach long-range planning. Anyway, what is his strategic thinking approach? I can't go through this chart in detail because in our executive development program, or programs, if you will, it'll take anywhere from 12 days to 24 days to deal with every issue that's on this chart. Essentially, we're starting off with now in the left-hand corner, dealing with Peter's theory of the business, which I'll discuss shortly, the mission and the purpose of the business, short-term objectives, including, as Peter pointed out, the important areas of marketing and innovation, as well as financial, doing an assessment of our external environment, which includes a number of elements, customers, competition, and so forth. The objective is to identify opportunities in the external environment, opportunities that we can pursue, and also potential threats. This leads into the old SWOT analysis, if you will. And then looking at our internal competencies, do we have the necessary competencies to be able to pursue some of the opportunities that we have identified. From this evaluation, or from this assessment, we can then make a decision, what's the most appropriate strategy that we want to pursue. Out of this, we developed a plan. In some cases, this may require changes in organizational structure. Drucker always said, structure follows strategy. And then this gets converted into a competitive strategy, identifying long-term objectives and so forth. The key questions here that we are asking, what is our business, the mission? What will our business be? Based upon certain changes in the environment today, should we change our strategy? And what should our business be? In other words, the vision for the future. This is usually one of the first questions we ask our executives when we start off our strategy program. What is the purpose of a business? And we add these, and we have these little blanks for them to fill in. Okay. The purpose of a business is to blank a blank and to blank a blank. Typically, we will get responses such as to make a profit and a host of other type of responses. And we would say, no, that's not what Drucker defines as the purpose of the business. Actually, the first blanks are to create a customer. And then we added in our programs the second two blanks, and to retain a customer. It's based upon marketing statistics and so forth. We know that it takes 5 times more to create a customer than 5 times more expensive to create a customer than to retain a customer. So the purpose of a business is to create a customer and to retain a customer. Now, where does profit come in? This is a fairly lengthy discussion that Drucker has, but in short, he says that profit really is the measurement of how well you do this. If you do a good job, excellent job of creating customers and retaining them, you will be profitable. You also state profit is the cost of the future. And it's a fairly lengthy discussion that we cover in our book. Also, Drucker's theory of the business. He said there's three pillars or assumptions that this needs to be a fit. There has to be, our assumptions about the environment that we operate in. Why do we get paid? Assumptions about our mission. Okay, what is it that we consider to be results? And our core competencies, how do we accomplish our mission? Drucker wrote an extensive article in Harvard Business Review a number of years ago about the theory of business that deals with these 3 elements in more detail. We also covered in our book. This is a short summary of that chart that I showed you in terms of the strategic marketing process, where we actually start with the external environment, a situation analysis, with the objectives to identify opportunities and potential threats. And then looking at our internal environment, do we have a fit? If we identify particular opportunities to pursue, do we really have the necessary capabilities, the core competencies to pursue those opportunities? Out of this, we can then define our mission and our vision, and then our strategies for competing and identifying our both long and short-term objectives. Where do we start? This is an interesting concept that Drucker has interwoven in a lot of his teachings and writings, a concept of what he calls planned abandonment. In other words, stop committing resources to the old. Here we have a typical life cycle of a product, from the introduction phase, growth, maturity, to declining. At what stage do we get rid of this product, develop a new one, and so forth? Well, where the blue arrow is, Drucker would suggest that this might be the time when we really want to get rid of this product, as opposed to perhaps the Boston Consulting Group that would say, well, this is where we would harvest rather than get rid of the product. So the question is, when do we get rid of dying products? Does your company have any dying products or services that should be discontinued? And how do we determine which ones to discontinue? concept of planned abandonment is a systematic policy of abandoning whatever is outworn, obsolete, or no longer productive. And these are some of the areas that Drucker suggests that we assess with respect to this concept. And that we need to do this on a regular basis, at least every 3 years, or as market conditions change. This is a series of questions Drucker would have us ask ourselves. Would we go into this product, this market, this distribution channel, knowing what we know today? Does the product still have a positive or negative net marketing contribution? And I'll expand on the concept of net marketing contribution. This comes from one of our pundits that we use to implement a particular Drucker concept, such as this one, planned abandonment. And what do we have to do to stop wasting our resources on this old product, this old market, this old channel, and so forth? This is a list of some of the areas, internal and external, that we might investigate in terms of should we abandon them. Products, services, customers that are more trouble than they're worth and not really contributing to our profit and so forth. And external or internal factors on the right-hand side, including what Drucker will call the back room. What type of activities that we do that really are not along with our core competencies that we can perhaps farm out to somebody else and make our back room their front room. Okay. Time and when to abandon. Oftentimes people say, well, there's a few good years left. This product still has a few good years of life. And Peter would say, don't tie up resources keeping it alive. Okay. Often we hear, well, it's been written off. It's no longer an asset on the balance sheet, which Peter would say it's an accounting view, not a strategic view. The cost of the asset may disappear from the balance sheet, but it's costing us a lot more to maintain this particular product or service. Okay. We're paying the sales force to try to sell a dying product. Where should they be employed, or where should they be directed in terms of their activities? Keeping the dead product alive or moving on? Okay. So Peter would say it's not the question of what it costs, the question is what does it produce? Or we'll talk about the concept of net marketing contribution. Here's a little case we gave our executive development people, or executives in our executive development program in China. And here we have a company, Shanghai Sportswear. You may have seen their labels when you go to stores in the United States. Most of the clothing are made there. Here's their product line from khaki pants and so forth, windbreakers, so forth and so forth. This is an abbreviated income statement showing their total revenues of $125 million and a net profit, net pre-tax profit of $10 million. If we examine their product line, we see that casual shorts, although we have $10 million in sales, is losing $1 million a year, and knitted sweaters is breaking even. So under the concept of planned abandonment, okay, we have our meeting with our chief financial officer and other people and say, well, you know, shorts losing $1 million, sweaters just breaking even, going along with Peter's concept of planned abandonment, maybe we ought to get rid of these two product lines. Well, if we do that, what would be the impact of net profit before tax? Well, you saw that we were making $10 million before. If we got rid of $1 million in losses, it should be $11 million in profit. Well, maybe not. Let's take a look at traditional measures of profitability with respect to just the one product, casual shorts. We have our profits. In this case, we're showing $1 million loss on sales revenues of $10 million. Our cost of goods sold, $8 million, and operating expenses of $3 million. Putting these together, this is yielding the $1 million loss. Let's take another look at expenses. Okay, cost of goods sold, marketing and sales expenses, and operating expenses. Everyone obviously relates to cost of goods sold, the variable costs required for making a particular product, manufacturing overhead, and so forth. Something that we typically do not see on our income statements is sales and marketing expenses broken out separately. What are we paying for marketing management? What are we paying for the sales organization? What are we paying for service and support services? What are we paying for advertising and promotion? This typically gets lumped into the category of G&A along with other operating expenses. Here we are saying let's break them out separately from the other operating expenses, such as research and development, the corporate overhead, what are we paying the chief executives, and so forth and so forth. Restating then the income for our casual shorts, we still have our $1 million in loss, $10 million in sales revenue minus $8 million in cost of goods sold equals $1 million in sales and marketing expenses. And then subtracting our operating expenses, this is how we end up with the $1 million in losses. $1 million in net marketing contribution minus $2 million in operating expenses. What we're saying here is that sales and marketing control certain areas of the big picture. But beyond that, they have no control over what we're going to pay the chief executive officer. We have no control over paying the overhead for the huge building and so forth and so forth. What can sales and marketing actually contribute to the organization? And that's why we're breaking this out. Therefore, going back to the big income statement, we now see that casual shorts is producing a net marketing contribution of $1 million, and the knitted sweaters is producing $2 million to still yield our $1 million in loss and our break-even point. Let's get rid of those two products as suggested by Drucker. Well, what happens? We still have the operating expenses that have to be allocated to the other remaining product lines, assuming that the shorts and the knitted sweaters are not made in a separate factory where they have their own machines, own building, and so forth and so forth. And in reality, what we end up doing is reducing our net profit or pre-tax profit to $7 million. So in this case, net marketing contribution using that tool in terms of assessing Drucker's planned abandonment would suggest maybe we won't want to get rid of these products at this particular point in time, at least not until we can come up with new product lines to substitute for these at some future time. So this is an example of how we close certain Drucker gaps. Okay. Planning and uncertainty. Why forecasting does not work. It's not strategic planning. What Drucker says, strategic planning is necessary precisely because we cannot forecast. Do you agree or disagree with Drucker's statement? Well, let me give an example. Consider for a moment the following situation. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, we witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Warsaw Pact of the terms that NATO was dissolved. The Soviet Union disintegrated and became Russia and numerous countries that existed prior to the Cold War. And West Germany and East Germany were united. In the fall of 1995, world leaders Mitterrand, Monroe, Thatcher, Bush, Reagan, Kohl, and Gorbachev attended a conference sponsored by the Bush Library, to review events of this unprecedented moment in history. While each head of state differed in opinion about why these events occurred, all agreed that predicting the end of the Cold War was inconceivable at the end of the 1980s. So despite all the resources available to them, the leaders of the most powerful nations on earth at that time were unable to predict events 2 to 5 years out. So if they couldn't do that, how can organizations predict the future? Just an example. As Drucker go on to say, believing we can predict the future is folly. Well, what do we do? How do we plan for uncertainty? And he will go on to say, organizations should start with what they know about the environment and then, given this knowledge, ask what they should be doing to meet the expectations of their shareholders. Traditional planning asks, what is most likely to happen? Planning for uncertainty asks, what has already happened? that will create the future. Well, let's explore this. Assumptions to base strategy on. This is what Peter defined as 5 certainties. We know these facts to be true. The collapsing birth rate in developed world and changing demographics, aging populations. I'll provide some examples for you in a few moments. Shifts in the distribution of an individual's discretionary income. Manufacturing becoming economically marginal in developed countries. Global competitiveness, and a growing incongruence between economic globalization and political splintering. Let's take a look at some of these. According to Drucker, this is the first certainty, the collapsing birth rate. The most important new certainty, if not only there's no precedent for it all of history, is the collapsing birth rate in the developing world. In Western and Central Europe and Japan, the birth rate has already fallen well below the rate needed to reproduce the population. And this is true for South Korea, for Singapore, and interestingly enough, for China. Demographics, just a few numbers for you. By 2030, not too long from now, 50% of Germany and Japan's population will be over 65 years old. 50%. These people aren't working. By 2050, Germany's total population will decline from 82 million to between 70 and 73 million people. By 2050, Japan's population will decrease from 125 million to 95 million. And by the end of the 21st century, the population of Italy may be 20 million people, down from 60 million people. This is the same for most other developed countries. Okay? Aging populations in China, we call it the 5-to-1 problem, as a result of the one-child policy that was implemented in the early 1980s. We have 4 grandparents, 2 sets of parents, and one young family trying to support them or take care of them in their older years. Let's take a look at China. In 2020, 248 million people will be 60 years old and older. Just 20 years later, 430 million, 1/3 of the population will be 60 years and older. By 2030, the working age population of 15 to 64 years old will only grow at a rate of 4% a year, while those in 50 to 64 age group will grow at a rate of 67% per year. That's between now and 2030. China, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, running out of people. They are offering bonuses for women to have more children. In Japan, the government has organized cruises for single people to go on a cruise, to meet each other, to ideally get married and have more children. What is going to be the impact of these statistics on our planning? United States, a little different situation. We have the issue of legal and illegal immigration. By the year 2040, not too far from now, new demographics will double our population to 600 million people from the current 300 million plus. Non-Latino whites will comprise less than 50% of the population. Spanish, not English, will be the predominant language in the United States. When I order some prescription drugs from the Veterans Administration, I now have to press 1 for English. And I'm wondering, when was the last time we fought Mexico in the war? Majority of immigration labor force will be uneducated. Few complete high school. If one wants some startling examples of this, just go on the web and look for Jaywalking with Jay Leno, the excerpts that he runs where he goes on the street and asks people certain questions. It's hilarious, but it's also pretty sad in terms of where we are. Okay, collapsing birth rate. Demographics will dominate politics. Government instability will be the norm. And we can look at the countries, particularly in Europe, when we see the changing demographics of those countries and the instability that's creating. Retirement will mean different things. The Greeks are rioting because they can't retire at the age of 50 anymore. Productivity of all workers will have to increase because we won't have enough. Implications for government? In the next 20 to 30 years, demographics will dominate the politics of developed countries. And Drucker goes on once again to say that government instability is going to be the norm. Take Greece as an example. It has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. It's losing its population. Its population is becoming an inverted pyramid. More old people on top, younger people on the bottom. To kind of summarize what's happening in Greece, Margaret Thatcher once said that with respect to socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. With respect to Greece, the problem is much of Europe is that we've advanced to the next stage. They run out of other people. Quotation by Mark Stein. If the politicians will look at the issue of demographics, they'll lead them to, and organizations as well will lead them to conclude a lot of the problems we're seeing today in these various countries and our own shortly are due to these particular factors here. Okay. Will a steady growth in the older people continue to provide market opportunities, and for how long? Will their incomes still be high or go down? Taxes increase, taking away income. Will they continue to spend freely, or will they continue or have to save more? Will they want to be young and spend, and so forth? So what are some of the issues that these collapsing growth rates will have? Second, certainly the distribution of income. Drucker says that this is the most reliable foundation of strategy, shifts in individual and family discretionary income. He observed that within the first decade of this century, there will be both changes in trends and changes within trends. China, as an example, we're seeing huge trends, changes in this distribution of income and how people are now spending on luxury items. Despite the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, 2010, and so forth, the sale of luxury items in China was the highest of any part of the world, next to Brazil. Trends in economic distribution. Drucker says discretionary income will go to certain product categories and or service categories, and they'll tend to last a long time. So we have to look at that, and they're typically impervious to various business cycles. So he says, let's watch for changes in trends and changes within a trend in terms of distribution of income. Once again, this goes back to the 5 certainties that we can start basing strategy on. This is what is occurring today, not forecasting. A decline in manufacturing. Drucker points out that manufacturing as a provider of wealth and jobs is declining in developed countries. Economically, it's becoming marginal in developed countries. The number of people that we have in manufacturing today has dramatically reduced, either through outsourcing or through increases in productivity. And the paradox, as Drucker points out, the manufacturing paradox, is that they're becoming politically stronger, meaning the various labor unions that make up what's left of our manufacturing base becoming extremely strong in terms of politics. Or certainly global competitiveness. Drucker says all organizations have to make global competitiveness a strategic goal. That is not to say that everyone has to go global and go overseas and open up operations in China or Europe. It means that we have to be able to compete with the world's best organizations, even if we're not competing in those countries. No organization can survive, let alone succeed, unless it measures up to the standards set by the leaders of the field any place. Drucker said that information travels too fast on a global basis. We have to be able to compete competitively on a global basis. global competition implication for businesses. It's no longer possible, as Drucker says, for a business to base its country on the country's economy on cheap labor. China is now outsourcing a lot of its manufacturing to Vietnam and other parts of Asia as their labor costs are increasing. And low labor productivity endangers a company's survival. But low labor costs are no longer enough to give us a competitive advantage and offset low labor productivity. And as Drucker points out, labor cost is now 1/8 of the total cost of a particular product. Difficult for companies to compete largely on labor costs. What are the implications for us in strategy? We face a protectionist wave throughout the world in the next few decades, according to Drucker. First reaction to a storm is to try to build a wall that shields one's own garden from the cold winds outside. And Drucker goes on to add that such walls no longer protect institutions and especially businesses. Is Donald Trump's raving about China fit into this model here? Okay. Is creating barriers, tariffs, and so forth really going to protect our industries? And Drucker would go on to argue, no, it will not. He'll cite numerous examples, such as machine tools, where barriers were created to protect our machine tool industries, and you no longer find machine tool companies in the United States. Our steel industry barriers were constructed to protect steel industry. Go to Pittsburgh and try to find a steel mill these days. Businesses that are protected and do not conform with the world standards will become more vulnerable. I noted just the other day that we are now going to put a tariff on solar panels coming from China. A little late for Solyndra, I might add. Okay. Strategy, therefore, we have to accept the new fundamental. Any institution has to be able to compete with the leaders of the industry any place in the world, even though we may not compete internationally. The fifth certainty, the growing incongruence between economic reality and political reality. The world economy is increasing, is becoming global. We can no longer define our scope in terms of national boundaries. We have to look at how do we compete or how do we stack up worldwide. And political boundaries are not going to go away. And basically what Drucker said was that national politics will overrule economic rationality. Going back to Donald Trump, should we create barriers to China so we can shut them off? Overlapping spheres, the economy and information, managing currency, regional economies, free trade versus protectionism, and national and local realities, both economic and more political protectionism. And Drucker said this is going to be the theme of this particular century. Let's go back. I've criticized Trump and a few others and talk about trade with China. Is there really a deficit? Well, you say, well, we're hundreds of billions of dollars in deficit with China. Well, is that really true? Drucker would break down trade in these various categories. First of all, there's what we call Asian trade. Japan, Korea, South Korea that is, Taiwan, have all set up manufacturing facilities in China to take advantage of a lower labor cost. Trade that initially came from Japan to the United States or from Taiwan to the United States or from South Korea to the United States now comes from China. So it's not really China trade, it's Asian trade. There's what we call institutional trade. U.S. companies shipping products or shipping components to China to be assembled, to be brought back to the United States for sale. Institutional trade. Then there's merchandise trade. This is the stuff when you go into Walmart and you pick up a dish or a blouse or whatever. It says made in China. This is the merchandise trade. Drucker says that there's also service trade. Financial services, large investment banking firms, banking, accounting firms, consulting firms, the Deloittes of the world. education. Almost every major university you can conceivably think of has a program in China. The entertainment industry, music, and so forth. Drucker would go on to add that the service trade is, if you will, could be understated by 50%, or rather our total trade could be understated by 50% because service trade is not counted except for every 3 months in an obscure report that is never mentioned. So we really have to look at trade from a lot of different dimensions. Fifth certainty, Drucker says, don't expand globally or go into business, especially by acquisition, unless it fits into your theory of business and overall strategy. And the business expansion be through alliances, not mergers and acquisitions. And I'll discuss this in a few months. That companies, if they're interested in going to places like China, should look at alliances, not going over there and acquiring firms. And also, obviously, we have to be able to manage our currency exposure or currency fluctuations today. As a side note, we look at the increase in gasoline prices. Noted in our area here in Florida, the increase 20 cents overnight from $2.69 to from $3.69 to $3.89, and many people talk about what's causing these increases in prices, and we hear it's the Mideast, and it's increase in demand in Brazil and China and India, and it's this and that and so forth. Very few people I've seen talk about what has happened to our currency in the last several years and how our currency has been devalued through the printing of trillions and trillions of dollars. It's not shown up in terms of the exchange rates between our currency and the other currencies, the euro and so forth, because their currencies have been devalued as well. So we're comparing apples and apples, and the apples are getting old and rotten. What does it mean? Okay, according to Drucker, major social changes that are creating the next society will dominate the executive's task in the next 10 to 15 years, maybe even longer. And when we talk about social changes, these are not the changes that we would hear from a Rick Santorum and the social issues that he is talking about. These are the social changes as a result of these 5 certainties that we previously discussed. And according to Drucker, they'll be more important for the success of the failure of an organization than economic events. So Drucker's insight, we can no longer define the scope of terms of national economy and national boundaries. We have to look at our industry worldwide to compete. We got to be able to compete with within our industry globally, even though we don't go global. And we have to learn to manage our currency exposures, currency fluctuations, and so forth. Kind of summarize his concept of planning an uncertain time, purposeful work and objectives. Starting out with sloughing off yesterday, what has to be abandoned as part of our systematic way to attain tomorrow. Look at different ways of attaining our objectives rather than believe that we can do the same thing again. And we have to look at the time dimension. When do we have to get started in order to be where we want to be in terms of achieving our vision in the future? Drucker talked about alliances will be more predominant in terms of expansion than mergers and acquisition. This is a quick chart that talks about the length of a particular business combination on the left-hand side from short-term to long-term, and the risk associated and the cost associated with a particular business combination. In the lower left-hand column here, we have we call it distribution. This is where we spend a lot of our time in consulting and in China, helping people put together marketing distribution agreements where a Chinese company would manufacture a particular product for specification based upon the U.S. company, and the U.S. company would distribute it in the United States. Very low cost to get into these agreements. In fact, generally speaking, no money changed hands. Just a marketing agreement. You will produce so many products, or so many pieces, and we will order so many pieces, and so forth. If either party does not perform, don't meet our quality specifications, or we don't sell enough, they can get rid of that particular agreement. Moving up the line to original equipment manufacturers, private labels, other forms of alliances, till we get into the more formalized ones where we have licensing, joint research and development agreements, particularly between companies such as pharmaceutical companies and universities doing research and development, to joint ventures and eventually acquisitions. So this is our spectrum of alliances. Drucker says a lot of deals will be done on the lower part of this graph, not the upper part. Drucker also says that it's cheaper to buy than to build. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, to move into a particular area, how does one do that? Well, we can move in, we can locate facilities, areas, build our factories, our distribution channels, hire people, train them, and so forth, or we can buy people that already exist. Our little case study, I was conducting a merger and acquisition class in China, and in the second day, a young lady came up to me and said, you know, I've been talking to my leader, which in China is our boss, about your class, and he said he would really like to talk to you, and they want to know how much you would charge. I said, well, how long does he want to spend? And she said, well, he's a very busy man, maybe 45 minutes to an hour. And so in that case, my fee would be a nice Peking roast duck dinner and a bottle of French red wine. She said, that's all? I said, yeah, that's fine. So several days later, they sent a Mercedes over to our apartment, picked us up, drove us over to his office, which turned out to be a building that he had built about 70 stories high. And he was the CEO, president, and owner of the #1 company in electrical appliances in China called Gomei, G-O-M-E-E. This, at the time, was what the industry looked like in terms of the number of companies competing in this particular industry. His question to me was, what do I do when Best Buy comes to China? How am I going to compete? And so we went back to Drucker's statement of, well, you know, will they buy or will they build? And going back at the history, many companies who tried to enter China by building failed. They didn't have the distribution system. They ran into many, many other problems. Over a period of years, people learned that. They decided, well, we will buy to get into the industry. So I said, well, you know, if there's no one to buy, Best Buy will have a difficult time getting into China. So this is kind of some of the deals that took place over a period of several years. Best Buy did come to China. They bought one of the companies, a 5-star appliance, $180 million, and that allowed them to enter China. But in the meantime, Gomei went to work. They bought another big competitor, China Paradise, for $618 million down in Shanghai, which was also a market extension. China Paradise had an option to buy Dashong, but they rejected the deal. Suning tried to buy them for $405 million, and they refused. And finally, our guy, Gomei, bought the company for $488 million, once again to sew up the Chinese Shanghai market. There was a rumor that Best Buy would try to buy the Selen Group, but they couldn't put a deal together. In the meantime, our guy came out and bought a piece of them for $76 million, once again to block Best Buy from coming in there, and then buying another competitor for undisclosed amount, market extension into another province. That left actually only one guy or one company that planned to expand organically themselves and not interested in doing a deal with Best Buy. So had I known at the time that this was the richest man in China, I probably would have asked for something more than a duck dinner, but as it was, he took the advice and implemented a particular strategy as a defensive way of preventing competition. Kind of wrap this up, this is a book that took a couple of years, 3 years for me to write, based upon my work with Peter and the fact that in putting together a strategy class, I found that Peter never wrote a book on strategy. He wrote one book in 1965, Managing for Results, which was more along the marketing line, more along management by objectives, but not on strategy. So in putting together a strategy program based upon Drucker's work, it took a lot of research to really put together a whole package of Drucker on strategy. And here, Richard Koch says in the Financial Times, Guide to Strategy, that although he wrote, 39 different books and held high esteem in a lot of different areas, he said very little about strategy. So the Strategic Drucker is one source you can go to for strategy, strategic thinking. It's based on research of his 39 books. I didn't read all of them, but a good percentage of them to find key elements that he talked about in terms of strategy. Thousands of his articles. Review of 65 years of his contribution to management and society. And as you'll see, we added other noted contributors to the discipline, sort of what I call the pundits. And then also a number of comments that he shared with me based upon a 30-year relationship as a student, colleague, and friend. As an example, when I came back from China on one visit to talk to him about our program, I said, Peter, the Chinese have just signed an executive order that allows them to declare war against Taiwan if Taiwan declares independence from China. How do you feel about that? And his comment was, the Chinese are not stupid. And his short answer, obviously, saying that don't worry about it, Bob. Okay, John Wiley and Sons, and I look forward to any emails you might want to send to us in terms of questions that I can respond to, add additional thoughts, and so forth.
Thank you, Dr. Swaim. Thank you for attending our presentation today. And let us remind everyone that the Harrington Group is a provider of consulting services and software for process improvement. Any questions regarding this presentation or requests for Harrington Group services for process improvement should be directed to Tom Quinn, tquinn@harringtongroup.com, or you can call us at 1-800-476-9000. Questions for Dr. Swaim directly can be addressed to robertswaim@hotmail.com. Again, thank you for attending today. Have a great day.